May 18, 1945. 23,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean. First Lieutenant Lawrence Stewart, the flight engineer aboard a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, felt the familiar, sickening lurch. The No. 3 engine had just lost power. This was not a surprise. This was a terrifying routine. As his pilot, Rocky, fought to keep the massive bomber stable, Stewart moved with practiced urgency, cutting the fuel mixture, closing the shutoff valve, and killing the ignition. Rocky ordered the propeller feathered, but the blades refused to move. The engine, now dead weight, continued to spin slowly in the slipstream, a phenomenon known as windmilling. This was more than a problem. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. The CFC gunner's voice crackled over the intercom, reporting a large stream of oil flowing from the dead engine. Stewart knew exactly what that meant. B-29 engines were built with magnesium components, a metal chosen to save weight, but with one catastrophic property. When ignited, it burns at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a fire so intense it could burn through the bomber's main wing spar in seconds. Approximately 150 miles from the safety of Iwo Jima, the airplane began to shake violently. The No. 3 engine fire warning light flashed on. The oil was gone. The moving parts had seized, and the friction had ignited the magnesium. Stewart activated the fire extinguisher, and the light went out. For a few moments, there was relief. Then, the light flashed on again. He fired the second and final extinguisher bottle. The light went out. Now, they were utterly defenseless. If the fire reignited a third time, nothing could stop it from consuming the wing and sending them into the Pacific. This single, harrowing incident was not an anomaly. It was the central, terrifying paradox of America's most advanced and expensive weapon of the Second World War. The B-29 Superfortress was designed to be an untouchable superweapon, a technological marvel that would bring Japan to its knees from altitudes no enemy fighter could reach. Yet, for the crews who flew it, the greatest enemy was often the machine itself. Of the 414 B-29s lost during the war, an astonishing 267 were not lost to enemy fighters or flak, but to engine fires, mechanical failures, and takeoff crashes. The story of the B-29 is not just one of technological triumph, but of a fatal flaw that made it one of the most dangerous aircraft for its own crews to fly. A flaw born from a desperate gamble in the race to end the war. The journey to this moment of terror began with a strategic problem of immense scale. After Pearl Harbor, American military planners faced the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. To strike the Japanese home islands, they needed a bomber with unprecedented range and altitude capabilities. The legendary B-17 Flying Fortress, a hero of the European theater, simply could not make the journey. In 1940, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a super bomber, capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs to a target 2,600 miles away, at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, and at an altitude of over 30,000 feet. The result was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most technologically advanced aircraft of the war. It was the first bomber with a fully pressurized crew cabin, allowing its 11-man crew to operate in relative comfort at extreme altitudes without bulky oxygen equipment. It featured a revolutionary remote-controlled defensive system, with 5 gun turrets and a manned tail position, all linked to computerized gun sights that automatically calculated for lead and bullet drop. The project was a monumental undertaking, costing over $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. By every measure, it was designed to be invincible, a machine that could fly higher and faster than any Japanese interceptor, raining destruction with impunity. But this technological leap came at a terrible price, centered on the bomber's heart. Its four massive Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone radial engines. Each engine was a marvel of engineering, an 18-cylinder air-cooled powerhouse producing 2,200 horsepower. They were, at the time, the most powerful aero engines available. They were also dangerously unreliable. From the very beginning of the B-29's development, the engines were plagued with a catastrophic tendency to overheat. The primary cause was the design of the engine cowling, which restricted airflow to the rear row of cylinders. These cylinders would heat up so rapidly, especially during the immense strain of takeoff with a full bomb and fuel load, that engine failure was a constant threat. The problem was compounded by the materials used. In a bid to save weight, the engine's crankcase was made of a magnesium alloy. While light and strong, magnesium is highly flammable. Once an engine fire started, it often became an uncontrollable magnesium fire, burning with a blinding intensity that could sever the aluminum wing spar in seconds, leading to catastrophic structural failure. In 87% of engine fires, the onboard extinguishers were useless. The crews, who called the ineffective firewall behind the engine the tin pan, knew that an engine fire was often a non-survivable event. The first operational missions in mid-1944, flying from bases in China under Operation Matterhorn, revealed the horrifying reality. The B-29s were indeed difficult for Japanese fighters to intercept at high altitude, but the bombers were falling out of the sky on their own. The combination of high ambient temperatures on the ground, maximum weight takeoffs, and the long, grueling climb to altitude created a perfect storm for engine failures. The losses were staggering. Air crews developed a grim joke that their biggest enemy wasn't the Japanese, but the manufacturer, Curtiss Wright, whose engines were killing them at an alarming rate. The crisis sparked a bitter dispute between the two corporate giants behind the program. Boeing, the airframe manufacturer, blamed Curtiss Wright for delivering a poorly designed and unreliable engine. Curtiss Wright fired back, blaming Boeing's tightly cowled nacelle design for providing insufficient cooling airflow. Both were right. The R-3350 engine was rushed into production with insufficient development, and its installation in the B-29 created a combination of problems that engineers scrambled to fix. Exhaust valves were found to be failing and being ingested by the engine. The carburetors distributed fuel unevenly, leading to backfires that could ignite the magnesium supercharger. So, why would America field its most vital strategic weapon with such a known fatal flaw? The answer lies in the immense pressure of the war. The B-29 was not just an aircraft. It was the central pillar of the entire strategy to defeat Japan. There was no alternative. The decision was made to press the bomber into service and solve its problems in the field. This led to one of the most chaotic production efforts of the war, known as the Battle of Kansas. In early 1944, brand new B-29s were flown directly from the factory to modification centers, where thousands of civilian workers and AAF personnel worked around the clock in freezing weather to incorporate hundreds of essential changes. Engines were swapped, baffles were installed to improve airflow, and new oil systems were fitted. It was a desperate, brute force effort to make the bombers combat ready. The program was deemed so critical that General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, personally intervened to break the logistical logjam. The decision was a calculated gamble. The AAF was willing to accept a high rate of operational losses in order to get the B-29 into the fight, believing its strategic impact would justify the cost. Slowly, through a combination of field modifications and new piloting techniques, the situation began to improve. Mechanics replaced the top 5 cylinders on engines every 25 hours. Pilots learned to perform critical magneto checks while already rolling down the runway for takeoff, minimizing the time the engines spent idling on the ground, where they were most likely to overheat. But the true turning point came with a change in leadership and strategy. In January 1945, General Curtis LeMay took command of the B-29 force in the Marianas. LeMay, a ruthless pragmatist, recognized that the high-altitude precision bombing campaign was failing, not only because of the engine problems, but also because of the then unknown jet stream winds over Japan, which blew bombs off target. He made a radical decision. He ordered the bombers to attack at night, from low altitudes of 5,000 to 9,000 feet, and stripped them of their defensive armament to carry more incendiary bombs. This new tactic was devastatingly effective. The low-altitude approach put less strain on the R-3350 engines, dramatically reducing mechanical failures. Flying at night neutralized the threat from the few Japanese fighters that could reach them. The resulting firebombing raids, particularly the March 9th to 10th, 1945 raid on Tokyo, caused destruction on a scale never before seen, burning 16 square miles of the city and killing over 100,000 people. The B-29, despite its flaws, had finally become the war-winning weapon it was designed to be. The Superfortress would go on to cement its place in history with its final, decisive missions. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Bockscar dropped the second on Nagasaki. The aircraft that had begun its life as a deeply flawed and dangerous machine had delivered the blows that ended the Second World War. In total, 3,970 B-29s were built. Its development was a story of breathtaking innovation, immense industrial power, and a terrifying engineering failure. The unprotected fuel tanks of the Japanese Betty bomber were a deliberate choice, sacrificing crew survival for performance. The B-29's flaw was different. It was the unintended consequence of a nation in a desperate hurry. A nation that gambled it could fix a catastrophic problem in the crucible of combat. For the thousands of airmen who flew it, the Superfortress was both a technological marvel and a flying inferno. It was the plane that won the Pacific War, but it did so with engines that were, for much of its service, its own worst enemy.